Hey there everybody, it's Mike DiLisio, and today I'm going to be reviewing Final Girl from designers Evan Derrick and AJ Porfirio and publisher Van Ryder Games. In Final Girl, the theme is one of a slasher film, a horror movie, where you are the final girl facing off against a killer, trying to protect yourself, save yourself, and hopefully save some other victims along the way. You are doing this through a modular type of a game system where you are choosing a particular killer and a location and final girl and putting them all together to create an experience. This is a solo-only game, so let's head over to the table. I'll give you a general overview on how the game plays, then we'll come back here and I'll give you my final thoughts. Okay, here we see a game of Final Girl set up, and a couple of things I want to point out right off the bat, just as points of reference, is that some of the components that you're going to see here are not necessarily going to be in every version of Final Girl. There are a couple of things that were add-ons through a Kickstarter campaign. Number one is that you have these two playmats. They're not necessary to play the game at all, but they certainly are nice, and those are represented in this overview. And also, the miniatures here are something that is an upgrade. Again, not necessary to play the game, but it sure does add a nice little bit of thematic immersion, and I figured that since we had access to them here, I would go ahead and show them to you. But otherwise, this is essentially how a game of Final Girl is going to look set up. Another thing that I wanted to mention just briefly at the beginning is that this is kind of a unique game system, meaning that to play a game of Final Girl, you're going to need a couple of things. You're going to need the core box, which is right here. That's going to have many of the components that you need for every game of Final Girl. But then in addition to that, you need to have at least one feature film box. And these feature film boxes are going to contain the different killers, your enemy that you are facing off against, and a location. So right now you're seeing a feature film box that has Hans the Butcher as our killer and Camp Happy Trails as our location. These also have different final girls that you are playing as in each of them, but there are a number of different feature film boxes that you can get that have different killers and locations that are available to you, and they all are going to play slightly differently. Some of the killers are going to have different rules that are associated with them. We chose what is essentially a good starting setup here where there are no additional rules beyond the core game rules for what we have here. The final girl that I have chosen here is Raiko, who is represented right here on the location board, but there are many, many, many different final girls that you can play as in the game. Again, I believe there are two of these that are included in each of the feature film boxes, okay? All right, so the way the game works is that you are going to be playing out over 5 phases of a game turn until you either win the game, hopefully, or lose the game, all right? And the 5 phases are as follows. You've got the action phase, the planning phase, the killer phase, the panic phase, and the upkeep phase. And so what I'm going to do is just go briefly through all 5 of those phases just to give you, again, a general overview of the game, how it plays. Just understand that there are a lot of nuances and small details that for the purposes of time, I'm going to leave out. And again, just giving you a general idea on how the game works. So, in the action phase, you're going to be playing cards. So this is a game where your actions are determined by cards. You have some starting cards that have 0 time cost down here in the bottom. That helps you denote these are your starting cards. There are other cards that you are going to be able to kind of access throughout the game that are going to allow you to do more powerful actions throughout. But all of these different actions are going to require dice rolls to determine their relative success or failure, okay? So, in the action phase, you're going to be playing these action cards to do a number of different actions, all right? And making rolls to see whether you are successful, how successful you are or not. Out here on the location board, there's a couple of things. You can see the different locations that are outlined by these kind of lines. You've got the killer that starts here, the final girl that starts there, and these yellow meeples are victims. Those were all randomly determined with a setup card that happened throughout the game. There are different setup cards that you just kind of shuffle and randomly choose one and place it out there. All right, so the different things that you might want to do on your turn, I'm going to kind of just show you. These are your starting cards. So you can gain some focus, and what this is going to do is adjust the horror track here. It starts on 4. I find that out by looking on Han's board. The horror level starts at 4, which means that for your checks, you're going to be rolling 2 dice. If it goes above 6, you're only rolling 1. If it gets down below 2, you're rolling 3. So if I wanted to start moving this horror track over so that I'm potentially getting access to more dice, I could play this focus card. What I would do is, in this case, I would roll 2 dice, and I'm trying to hopefully get 2 successes. If I do, I knock the horror track down 1, and I gain 2 time. I start with 6 times. So I'm just going to briefly again show you how these work. So let's say I was playing a focus card. I would roll 2 dice. The dice have they are custom dice, and they have different faces. This is a failure. Blank means it doesn't do any good. This is a success. This means that I can discard 2 cards to gain a success. All right, so you get a success, but it's at a cost. So if I were trying to gain focus, I rolled that, I get 1 success. All right, in this case, 1 success here shows that I can reduce the horror track, but I lose a time. So let's say, for example, I had done that, I reduce this down to 3, and I knock the time down 1. All right, I had 2 of those cards I can play. Rest, a short rest here, is if you have taken any damage, this is a way that you can get some health back. 2 successes gets you 2 hearts back. 1 success gets you 1 heart back and you lose time. If you get no successes, you get a heart, you get a health back, but the terror track or the horror track goes up 1, you lose a time, and your turn immediately ends. That's what that symbol denotes, okay? Even if you had more cards that you potentially could spend. You could also attack the killer if you are in the same spot with it. You can do 1 damage with 2 successes, or 1 damage but you yourself lose a health, or no successes means that you lose a health and your turn immediately ends. How do you get to these locations so that you can potentially fight off the killer or try to save the victims, which I'll talk about in a moment? Well, you start with a couple of walk cards, all right? And with these, 2 successes means that you can move up to 2 spaces and you lose a time. 1 success, you move up to 1 space and you lose a time. No successes, you move up to 1 space, but you lose a health and you lose 2 time. Or you could just lose 2 time, not move at all, but not also gain any damage to your character. So Raiko here started with 6 health. So you don't have an unlimited amount of health. You need to be careful about that. Also, as I mentioned, you'll be playing these cards, and once you do, you place them into a discard pile. So let's say I had done a walk, and maybe I had moved 2 spaces. One of the things that you can do is you can save victims, and you do that by looking at the little locations on the board that have these kind of green outlines and a door. If you're able, when you move, you can take up to 2 victims with you. They will never follow you into the killer's space, however. That just, they're not that gullible. But let's say that I had been able to move from here to here, and I take both of these victims into this exit spot. What you could then do is you place them, and I flung the final girl card. You can place them onto the final girl card to get some boons. You can either gain 2 time, gain a health, take the planning action card, move a couple of spaces. Once all 5 of these have gotten filled up, then you flip it over and you've got a nice power here, okay? And also, for each victim saved, you're going to gain a time, all right? Each final girl will have different elements on their cards that you can trigger by getting victims saved and on those cards, okay? All right, so moving around, you can also get into the spot of the killer and take attacks on them. There are other cards that you're going to be gaining, and how do you do that? You do that in the next phase, which is the planning phase. Okay, so the planning phase is where you are going to be getting access to these more powerful cards that you could then use in future turns. So the way this is going to work is you're going to be spending time that you had not used on your turn to purchase these cards. The cost to purchase the card is on the lower right here. So for example, this distraction card would cost me 3 time to get access to. So let's say, for example, in that last turn that I had played a focus and 2 walk cards, and let's say that through the course of die rolls, I had lost 2 time and I was at 4 time when I chose to end my turn, or potentially sometimes when I'm forced to end my turn. So with those 4 time, I could purchase cards. There are some rules to that. Number one, you can't purchase action cards that were played or discarded since the last time you had a planning phase, or in the first times from the beginning of the game. You can also obviously not spend more time than you have, and you can't purchase a card if you already had 10 cards in your hand, so there is a limit to that. But let's say I had these 4 cards. I could purchase perhaps a search card, which would cost me 2, so I would knock this down 2. And searching is good because a search card is going to allow you to potentially get items that are up here. Now, you can only search in certain locations. In this case, you've got the dock, and you've got the cabins, and you've got the utility shed, and you've got items that are specific to each one of those locations. But those give you some nice bonuses and abilities. So maybe I'd want to get a search card for my next turn or a later turn. And then maybe I have 2 left. I would want to get a sprint card. That would take me down to 0. And a sprint card is a better movement card. All right? Then I would reset this back to 6. Once you have done that, you would take any action cards that you had played or discarded since the last planning phase and put them back into the tableau. So here, I had played these 3 cards. They're all 0 cost action cards. They would go there. On a later turn, I can get those cards back for free because they don't cost any time, as long as I had not already used that same card. All right? So that is essentially the planning phase. Next up, we've got the killer phase, and this is, as you might expect, where the killer is going to do its damage, and the part where you're going to start feeling a lot of heat on your turn. So the first thing you're going to do is we're going to resolve the killer action. In this case, it is this action right here, which is basically saying that if the final girl or a victim is in their spot, they're going to attack them. They're always going to choose to attack a victim before the final girl. But in the case that we have right now, here's Hans. No one's in his space, so that's not going to happen. The next thing that you're going to do is you're going to draw the top terror card, and you're going to resolve its effect. The terror deck is right over here. Let me show off how these look, and they're going to tell the killer to do some things. So, in this case, he just keeps coming. So the first thing it's going to do is it's going to show you who the killer is targeting. In this case, either the final girl or a victim. Sometimes it'll say one or the other, but in this case, it'll go either or. It's going to move once, and it's going to attack once. So how do we know those movement and attack values? You look over here, and you compare it to the bloodlust meter, which starts at the bottom. This is saying that its base movement is 1, and its attack is 2 damage. So if this had not been moved up at all, it's going to target either the final girl or victims, whichever one is closer. And in this case, these victims are closer. So it would move 1 space towards them. And at this point, if they were in that spot, it would do an attack. And again, it would be 2 damage. And each of these victims only need 1 damage to defeat them. So these will have different... Oops. Also, actually, the first thing is it's going to adjust the horror meter. All right. But all of these have different kind of things. Telling you who they're targeting. This time it would move twice. Only going after the final girl, moving twice, attacking once. Things along those lines. Also, sometimes it will tell you that you place new victims out in different locations. All right? So you would do the... you would do the actions denoted on the terror deck during that killer phase. One thing, though, that I did want to point out is that if the killer does attack you as the final girl and you've gotten one of these defensive cards that have a slightly different background, you could play those cards out of your turn during the killer's phase to try to defend yourself and perhaps even retaliate and do damage back to the final girl. All right, after the killer phase, we've got the panic phase, and that is only going to trigger if at least 1 victim was killed this turn, and the victim's in the same space as the killer. All right, so if there were victims still in the same space as the killer and at least one victim was killed, they're going to panic. Makes sense, right? They're going to try to get out of there. For each victim that is in the space, you're going to roll one of these dice, and they all have numbers on them, and each of the locations give you where they're going to move depending upon values that are rolled on the dice. If there's no values that are represented, then they're going to stay where they are and potentially be in danger for the next turn. All right, so the panic phase is just basically victims potentially fleeing if they're in the same space as the killer and he killed anyone that turn. Finally, we've got the upkeep phase. There's usually not a whole lot you have to do. If there are no cards left in the terror deck, that's going to trigger the finale card, which is down here, and going to kind of push the game forward. And then if there are any events or items that require upkeep, then you might you would have to do it at that point. All right? So you're going to continue to play through the game, through these phases where you are potentially doing some damage, hopefully doing some damage to the killer here, doing some hurt. Their bloodlust is going to increase every time they kill somebody, which is going to make them more powerful, going to make their attacks more powerful. It's going to make their movement better. It's going to reveal some dark powers. So in this case, this was a randomly chosen one, a sledgehammer massacre. For every attack, Hans attacks you and each victim in a space once. So that's not great. You've got a finale card, which is going to make Hans's action much more powerful, increase the bloodlust. Then it's going to go after either the final girl or a victim, 2 movement and a attack. So you only win if you defeat Hans by knocking out all of his power, and Hans will knock you out for him to win, okay? One last thing I wanted to point out is that you've got these little tokens that represent the last hit point, so to speak. So he started with 12. Once you knock out 11, you're down to 1. At this point, a couple things happen. First of all, you're rolling an extra die on your checks, but you're going to flip these over. There are a number of these tokens, and you randomly shuffle them at the beginning of the game face up, like face down like this, and you flip it face up. Now this shows nothing on the back. So if you had knocked this piece, this last point out, Hans is well and truly dead. But perhaps you might not have that. So Reiko gets knocked down to her last health. You flip it over, and aha! 2 more health. So what that means is that you'll put this one white marker there and 1 more health, and you have almost died, but you've got just enough left to try to do the final blow to the killer. All right? That, in a nutshell, is Final Girl. Again, there are a lot of little nuances and things that I did not cover here, just giving you an overview. Let's head over, and I'll let you know what I think. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a good general idea on how the game plays. Let's talk a little bit about my thoughts on the game. The first thing that I want to do is talk about some solo benchmarks. These are some high-level things that I like to consider when I'm choosing a game off the shelf or not. The first thing is the win-loss condition. Is there a clear win-loss condition, or are you going for a beat your high score type of a variant? Well, in Final Girl, this is a solo-only game, and you are going facing off head-to-head with that killer. So a clear win-loss condition, which is really the way you want to go in a game like this. It's really the only way it could work. It's not an optimization puzzle type of a game. This is you have to survive. You have to do everything you can to make it through and defeat that killer, and they're trying to defeat you. You're just knocking out health points. So a very clear win-loss condition. The other thing I like to talk about is setup and teardown, and in the case of Final Girl, there's a fair amount of setup and teardown. However, the way the game is set up, as far as the actual physical components, makes it less of an arduous task, because everything is so clearly delineated, and there's a place for everything and everything in its place, and if you just had all of this thrown together in one box, that would be a massive headache, a huge mess. So the way it's set up with each box having its own kind of place, it makes the setup a lot more manageable, and it is reasonable for the amount of time that the game takes to play. So actually, I have nothing really but good things to say about the amount of time it takes it to set up and tear down, and that is almost solely because of the care and attention that was clearly taken to the storage aspect of the game. The other thing, the last thing I want to talk about in the benchmarks is rules, and I have to tell you, this is something that if you watched any of my recent reviews is a really big issue for me. I am finding increasingly that it is difficult oftentimes to learn a game strictly from the rule book. I feel like a lot of times there are assumptions that players are going to go off to alternate sources, whether it's Board Game Geek or How to Play videos, to learn how. And I'm happy to state that the rule book for Final Girl is very good. I was able to learn the game from the rule book, and there were clear examples. Now, one thing that the rulebook does, and I do appreciate that, is because of the design of this modular system, they make a point to stress in the rules that there's almost inevitably going to be edge cases, strange interactions, timing conflicts, things along those lines. Anytime that you've got disparate elements all coming together to create a modular game, there's going to be a higher potential for that to happen. But what they do is they give you basically kind of three guidelines that you can choose from to say, all right, well, do I want to choose, and you would do this before you start the game. If there's any ambiguity, I can either choose the thing that is going to be most negative for me, or I could choose something that makes the most thematic sense, things along those lines. So I appreciated that they addressed that in the rule book. In a game like this, there are inevitably going to be instances where you have to kind of make some judgment calls, and I appreciate that they addressed that in the rules. The next thing I want to talk about is art and components. Now, the art in this game, I think, really suits the theme. One thing that I have not mentioned to this point is that Final Girl is really a re-implementation of an earlier game called Hostage Negotiator. This is something that I'm going to come back to later on, but I was not a huge fan of the graphic design and art in Hostage Negotiator. This still, Final Girl still has kind of a similar feel, but I do feel like it has been improved. And I feel like it suits this theme. The art suits this theme better than the art in Hostage Negotiator suited its theme. And so I'm very happy to say that I'm impressed with the art overall, because I was a little bit concerned about that coming in because it was an issue I had with Hostage Negotiator. Now, I showed some of the add-ons in the overview, the playmats, the miniatures, for example. Those are really nice, and they do, I believe, add to the thematic immersion, but they're not necessary. You don't need to have the playmats, you don't need to have the miniatures to have a very good experience with the game. I will say, if you are going to splurge and you get those, they're great. They do add, I think, a nice little spice to this stew, but they're not necessary. And then the last thing I want to talk about is something I touched on a moment ago, which is that the modular box system is just superb. It is functional. I really love the magnetic closures and how basically the outer edges of the boxes are also the location and killer boards. That's brilliant. It really is a very economic use of components. The molded plastic trays work very well. Again, if you're an organization nut, which I'm really not, honestly, I'm not the most organized person, but I appreciate when good organization is presented to me as a gamer, and Final Girl has that in droves. So really just a magnificent storage system for that component. Now, overall solo experience. First thing I'm going to do is talk about a couple of things that maybe didn't work as well for me, and then I'm going to end with the things that I really liked about the game. The first thing is something that was actually a carryover a bit from Hostage Negotiator, which is that the game plays out in a somewhat repetitive loop. You're essentially going to be doing the same types of things on your turns. It's not the most dynamic of gaming systems, all right? You're essentially just going to be playing out your actions. There are a relatively limited pool of actions of moving and attacking, searching, maybe trying to buff up your health, tweak that horror track to be in your favor. So it's a bit of a repetitive loop that you're going through. It also can feel very luck dependent, because anytime that the actions that you take are almost always dependent upon a dice roll, those dice are not going to always work to your favor. And the way the distribution works on those dice, you're very often going to have to be spending cards to gain successes. And that can feel a little bit punishing. at times in the game. You just have to be aware going in that luck plays a pretty big role. So those are the two things that are slightly negatives. On the positive side, this takes everything that I liked about Hostage Negotiator and makes it better. Hostage Negotiator was a game that I liked quite a bit, but I felt like I played it out. I played it a lot, and I felt like it had just kind of run its course with me. Final Girl takes everything I liked about it and adds to it and makes it where the replayability is off the charts. Everything that they added to the core system of Hostage Negotiator is a positive. There's not one thing that I can think of that Final Girl added that I don't like. And that's not always the case when there's a re-implementation of a game. Sometimes it'll be like, well, I like this part, but I really don't like this. There's nothing like that in Final Girl. Everything that they've added is something that I feel is a positive. The modular gameplay is perfectly implemented. It really is. It feels different enough when you're playing with different killers or different locations or different Final Girls that it adds to that replay value, but it's not so different that you feel like you're overwhelmed with administering. So what are the extra rules here? What do I have to remember? It's just that right mix of variability without too much mental cognitive load that you have to deal with. Once you've got the core system of the game down, adding in the different modular elements are easy enough to administer, but they still bring enough of a change for it to really feel like something that is significant. I also actually prefer this theme to Hostage Negotiator. Now, I know I'm doing a lot of comparisons, and if you have not played Hostage Negotiator or you're not familiar with it, then these aspects of the review might not be as helpful to you. But for those that have, I do prefer this theme, not just as an overall theme. Hostage Negotiator was an interesting enough theme, but I feel like the mechanics in this game are better reflected in the theme. Okay, so there's a better marriage between theme and mechanisms in Final Girl, in my opinion, than there was in Hostage Negotiator. And so I really feel like it took a game that I already liked, made it much, much better, and added this really, really clever modularity to it that means it's something that I want to keep coming back to over and over again. I know they've already announced a second season for the game, so I'm sure that means many more killers, many more locations, many more Final Girls to come, and I'm all in. I'm all ready for it. I'm going to be giving Final Girl a 9 out of 10, a seal of excellence. I feel like this game is something that is fully realized. I feel like everything that they were trying to attempt was a hit, was a positive. And you don't often see that, where you feel a fully realized vision that was brought forth. And so 9 out of 10, really, really highly recommend Final Girl for any solo gamer, especially if you are attracted to the theme. Really, really solid game. All right, well, that's it for me. This is Mike DiLisio signing off from Dice Tower headquarters.